Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
We talk so much about generational trauma. What about generational healing?
Hello, friends, and welcome back. This is True Crime Connections, and I am Tiffany, your host. Today, I am talking with a very dear friend of mine. He is the podcast host of the Silver Linings Handbook. He is a coach and a former journalist who worked with the New York Times. Please help me welcome Jayson Blair. Hello.
Hello, friend, and thank you for having me on. I'm honored for the opportunity. I love the fact that as somebody who's a listener and a part of your community, that I get a chance to come on, and I appreciate you coming on to talk on your episode of my podcast earlier in the year. I just thought it was such a powerful message that we don't normally hear about the impact of the trauma or of trauma on both the victims and perpetrators and the interconnections and how we can love both. And I think that was like meaningful to a lot of my listeners. Thank you.
No, absolutely. And I loved being on your podcast. So I'm glad people found value in it because I mean, that's why we do this.
Yeah. Why most of us do it, I think.
Yeah.
The others are there to make money because it's a well-known way to get rich, I hear.
That's so
We
they
haven't
say.
figured it out.
Today, we're going to talk about how sometimes our traumas can interfere with our connections with other people, because I do believe they go hand in hand.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about. You and I have talked about this idea that I've experienced, and I think stepping back, I've experienced trauma in life. And I don't think there's anything terminally unique about experiencing a trauma. When you are going through a trauma or you can feel very lonely and unique in your situation. And I think one important thing to remember is that suffering is universal. It's the one thing every human has in common, whether you're, a Native American or you're Black or you're white or you're a woman or you're a man. We have all suffered, and many of us have suffered through traumas. And I think for me, eh, my assistant likes to joke that other people see a dumpster fire and I see an opportunity to roast marshmallows. But I think one of the bright sides for me of trauma is that suffering has allowed me ultimately, after a very long road there, an opportunity to connect with people more deeply and love people more deeply. And I think a message that I tend to have for people who are going through the rough parts of it or feel like it's never going to end or nothing good will ever come out of it is that there can be a bright side and there can be good that comes out of it. You just, if you want to get there fast, be smarter than I am.
You had to learn at your own pace. And sometimes we don't get the clues right away.
I feel like that's what my mother used to say all the time. So Jason's working at his pace, also known as when is he going to get it?
It seems like you're on your way. It's a start. Better later than
No,
never, right?
right? Yeah. 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 And part of what I think originally or what's happened in the last few years for me, I guess I have to take the story back to the beginning. I am unbelievably lucky as a human being. I have two wonderful, amazing parents, an amazing brother. I always tell people I won the lottery. I won the lottery in terms of family. They're all patient, which you need to be with me. They're all very loving. I really think the milkman some days dropped me off. Like, not exactly like that. But they're all very patient. They're very loving. Both my parents were from large families and they were the only ones in their families who made it out of the rural areas and made it to college. Plenty of people in their families did very well, but they had opportunities other people didn't. And my brother and I had opportunities because of that that other people didn't. So it's a very idyllic life. And I think and looking back at that, I really appreciate it, and I don't know how I have a hard time even fathoming where I would have been if I had been in a different environment. Part of me says you'll never really know, but one of the things I want to start the story by saying is like how blessed I am and how lucky I feel I am. And I think that sometimes it comes from your family, sometimes it comes from your friends, sometimes it comes from your spouse. It can come from all avenues of your life. If you don't win the lottery in one area, you might win it in another. I'm just grateful. I think grateful for a lot of the people that I have in my life. We were talking earlier about when I was a young kid, I was sexually molested by an older teenage cousin. And the interesting thing about it, and I is for me, and this has been a pattern throughout my entire life. You could, I don't know, you could really run over me with a truck, and I'm so unlikely to retaliate. I'm like, whatever. And I tell people it's not like a self-worth thing. It's not that I don't deserve. It's like water off a duck's back, right? You have a problem with me? Join the long list. But I tend to like, if I'm gonna retaliate, it's usually because someone has hurt someone I love. And it can be a little hair triggery there. And I never said anything. And the way my parents tell me the story is that this was going on for some time. I never said anything until I walked into the bathroom and saw her molesting my 2-year-old. And my entire life from probably he's always my protectiveness of him, and I don't know if it comes from that or was just because he was my baby brother, my protectiveness of him. Yeah, it's been a strong force, but told my parents in my little kid words where you don't even know that like something what is happening, it's bad. And I told them, and I was talking to my dad and my mom actually about it a couple years ago. And I was telling my mom, "You guys handled this perfectly." My dad was listening to the conversation. He said, "That's interesting because I think we handled it terribly. We didn't act fast enough. We didn't do X, Y, or Z." And it was so interesting to hear their lens and how they felt this sense of like failure as parents when I, as a kid, felt like the sense of perfection. And that's something about our lenses in these situations. And it also says something about why we should talk about this, because I hope that was a comfort to them to hear that, hey, on the other side of this, like it was perfect. And my brother agreed. And in that, I think going through that experience, and I think for me and for a lot of people, it's inevitably life changing. But I've always believed that the way that they handled it and maybe just part of who we are, um, It it didn't affect me, and I don't know what to make of this next part, which is really interesting, and that came in that conversation with my parents. I was like, "M Guys, you remember when this cousin of mine, she had grown up, gotten older, had gotten into trouble, right?" I was like I was I didn't particularly like her, I was scared of her, but I was the one who said we should let her move in with us for a summer when we had moved, and I had invited them and begged them to do that, actually. That's how unaffected I felt by it. It was really weird, and they were like, "Yes, that was."
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, it was in fact, I'm like, "This is insane." A couple years ago, I don't know, like 10, 15 years ago, I r I ran into her in Washington, DC, and I was like, "How in the world do I not want to rip your head off?" I don't get it. But I hope she's changed. I hope good things. I hope because I view it a lot, I think you do, that there's more to that story that I don't know. There's something, some kind of hurt or suffering or loss, and it may be something that's happening internally inside of her. It may have been something external, but I think we as humans have this tendency to like it's almost like the Israeli Palestinian conflict. Like, whose fault it is, like, what year you decide to stop in history. And I think intergenerational trauma is a bit like that. Like, we're traumatizing each other, passing it on. And if I say that 1985 or 1986 is the year where we start this story, then you're the bad guy. But if we start the story in 1970, then maybe you're the victim. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about giving people grace or forgiveness. I do think people need to demonstrate that their behaviors are different for you to let them back into your life. But in terms of grace and forgiveness, understanding people are complex and life is complicated. But you would think, right, that going through an experience like that would have left me, I think, feeling wounded. And I actually, in a way, and looking back at my life, and I remember thinking about this in high school, wow, this experience of going through sexual abuse has made it so much easier for my girlfriends who have gone through sexual abuse to open up to me about the uncles who abuse them, the other people who have abused them. I feel that same way with my clients. It's actually shocking to me because I think sometimes in environments where I don't have closer relationships with people, how many people in those groups are experiencing abuse they didn't talk about when I could just compare it to environments where I am close with people and it's 1 in 3, 1 in 2, 1 in 4 in many of those environments. And I feel like that had been just such a blessing and such a gift to have that. And I guess that's one of the things that I enjoy talking to people about, the fact that there are some bright sides, that there are opportunities in those dumpster fires to make marshmallows, or as my old colleague at the New York Times used to say, make turn chicken shit into chicken salad. And so
Eating that salad.
yeah. And I imagine it's something that probably that concept of how do we acknowledge and accept and not run from our hurt, and how do we bring something good into the world from it, I think is just taking your time, giving yourself that space, and then finding your way to it. And I think for a lot of the people who, because in ways we are all victims of something, a lot of people who are victims of things in the moment, it's really hard to see the good for you that can come out of it, the good for other people that can come out of it. But in that moment where you're sitting there and someone is, let's say, for me, pouring their heart out and sharing something that they never would have otherwise shared if they didn't either A, know about your experience, or your experience hadn't changed the way that you interacted with people. I don't want to say it's all worth it because, good Lord, I wish that there was another way to become that empathetic or that caring or develop those skills. But in that moment, your suffering's worth it because you're alleviating someone else's suffering, just like my parents alleviated mine. And we're passing something down that isn't intergenerational trauma. It's intergenerational healing in a way. And I love that concept and that idea.
Oh, I love that. Generational healing. Yes. That's where it's at. We
Yeah.
need to stop passing down this craziness and instead pass down the strength that we
Yep.
have.
Yep. And I think that's one of the, whether you realize it or not, I think that's one of the most powerful things about your message. And part of what you're doing is really taking your own healing and passing it on to all your listeners and your guests and other people along those lines. Yeah, it's powerful and impactful, as you and your listeners know. And I danced through life after that. And I ultimately became a reporter. I worked for the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, New York Times, fairly young as a reporter. But one of the things when you're a young reporter, wherever you are, you're going to end up on the police beat. That's just going to be a part of it. Disasters, fires, midnights, and weather stories. That's the other thing you're always going to end up doing, weather stories. People, how they feel about the rain. I don't know. What do you?
It's
So,
wet and cold.
yeah. I didn't even know how to formulate the questions at that point. But I was after the pandemic began, it was right in March 2020 as the pandemic was beginning, I had made the decision after years of not regularly being in therapy. I was like, I really need to go back to therapy. We're like in the middle of this crisis. I'm running a business. I've got all these people I love and care about. I need to be strong for them. I need to be strong for me and not allow my anxiety to run out of control and start making insane decisions in this great unknown. If anybody remembers the great unknown. And so I went back to therapy and it was really like great. Like it was wonderful to have the support and somebody to process everything that was going on. But as things stabilized in the pandemic, we began to, instead of focusing on the acute crises, looking forward. And just this time where my therapist and we were talking about something related to my reporting, and I can't remember how it came up, but I was telling her the story of one of my first stories was a crime story, and I was in high school. It was like the summer after high school, and I was working for the weekly newspaper, and I can't remember whether it was like 4 or 5. I think was it 4 or 5? It was 4 or 5 kids, local kids who were my age, who went to the school right beside my school, the high school beside mine, where my mom was also a teacher at the time. They had seen a movie where a bunch of kids laid under a train, and they went out to Manassas, Virginia at the train yard and laid under the train, but they didn't know about cattle prods on trains, which are like meant to knock cattles and debris, and they're very low as opposed to the rest of the train. And they were destroyed. And I remember the scene. There were like small parts of bodies for probably 50 yards. So take a lot to stop a train. And I'm telling her the story, and I think it was something about like my affect, which was not like this in telling the story. I certainly wasn't giggling as I was telling her, but I was giving her the example, and I started giving her other examples. One, I'm not sure if I gave her this one at this time, but I'm sure I did. But one time where I was like, I should definitely consider pulling back from police reporting. So sitting in Brooklyn in the middle of the night, and when you're a police reporter during the day, there are always police lines. So you have to stay back and you can't actually talk to the detectives. You have to hide around the corners they're going to come into and try and get to them. But at night, there are no rules. So you're like rolling up on the crime scene, chatting with him. And one time there's this guy who's shot, his body's in the road in Brooklyn. And the detectives are like laughing and joking, normal gallows humor. And the detective is, do you want a Pez? And I'm like, sure, I'll take a Pez. And so he takes the Pez dispenser and he like hands it to me. And I look down and I'm taking a Pez over a dead body. I had become that desensitized to it that I was like, "Hmm, maybe I should take a break." But that should have been a sign. And this is just more evidence that I'm a knucklehead because that, that should have been a sign. And so I'm telling her these stories, and she's like, how many dead bodies have you seen? And I do not know. And I started counting in my head because I've seen in plane crashes. I was there in New York for 9/11, all sorts of murders and accidents. One that strikes me, just hits me at my core is interesting. The one that I have the most reoccurring thoughts about is not a murder at all. It's a little girl who's like 12, 11-year-old girl who was just walking with her book bag outside of her school and a brick fell off the top of the roof and killed her. That's the reoccurring one. It was very funny. I don't walk by buildings the same way other people do.
I could imagine.
Yep.
That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about the randomness, I think, the fragility of human life and the randomness of death that are frightening. Anyway, so my therapist wisely sent me off and she was like, you have a project. I want you to come back with a count. And I came back the next week and I was like, I stopped counting at 200. And she asked me after I racked them up for her and my, like drownings, plane crashes. I was there 9/11, but also the plane crash that happened in November afterwards where the plane actually crashed in the middle of a street in Far Rockaway, 747. It's not the bodies. It was the luggage and the trees. like kids' little stuff and things like that. So she asked me, how many of those were natural deaths? Oh, and I was like, zero, none. Like, I didn't see my grandfather die. I had never seen, until my mother died last year, I'd never seen natural, natural death. So everything was very unnatural. And I think one of the things that I learned in that therapy that was really amazing, and I was lucky, my therapist really trauma informed. She had a lot of experience with trauma because she worked with first responders, EMTs, firefighters, police officers. But one of the things that was very interesting was came to the conclusion that I had without even realizing, because through my whole life, I thought like I was traumatized by the sexual abuse, but I managed it relatively well. And now I'm fine. But that I had really built these like walls that separated people. And I know all of our walls can look very different. My walls, like I've told you, operated a bit like a light switch where I could emotionally invest and engage, and then I could turn it off in a moment and like just go. Like people think of that and they think, oh, you turn into a serial killer. I'm like, no, it's just the absence of. It's not like necessarily darkness. It's just nothing. It's just feeling nothing, which is great in a crisis or if you're like a sniper. It's be very adaptive skills in certain moments. But what I found was the way I described it to my therapist, I was like, it's really easy to turn the switch off. It's very hard. And so the metaphor we use is you've got to make a decision. Do you want to be a guy with a light switch that can make all your emotions go away and you feel safe because you can control this and you can turn it off? Or do you want to be a guy with a dimmer? It might take a little bit longer. You may not have as much control over it. You may need to go back and forth. And initially I was like, I and I'm not kidding. I was like, of course I want to be a guy. It's switch. Who wouldn't? Make your emotions.
Right.
But actually the metaphor that kind of pounded through my head was like painkillers. You have a bottle of Percocet after an accident and like the pain is starting to go away, but you're afraid the pain's gonna come back. You just grab the Percocet, like, and actually it was just an itch. And now, you know, now you're completely high and or whatever it is. That when you have that light switch, how do you know you're not flipping the switch too early or flipping the switch and missing out on an opportunity for joy? Because you don't really, I really am a firm believer of no light exists without darkness, no joy exists without sadness and pain. So intellectually, I got that part, but she was such a cool therapist because she just said, you have to just make a choice. Do you want to be this person who feels safe and misses out on joy in life? Because that might actually work for you. Or do you want to take the risk and jump out and try and feel? And so after about a year of going back and forth, I was like, I'm gonna make the jump to try to feel. And trust me, it wasn't like I decided and then it happened in some fits and starts, man, and some running back to that compartmentalization and that light switch. But one of the things that I think one of the great big revelations, like as an example in this for me, was eventually I realized in this process that my mom had been ill for 6, 7 years. And I realized I had actually, as much as I love her and as much as I meant to her, I had been pulling away from her. In retrospect, I can hear things in my head that my partner, my sister in law said about, "Well, your mom's not going to be around, Jay," or other things forever. I think they were picking up on the fact that I was pulling away as she was getting sicker. And I think one of the really cool things about deciding to feel is it allowed me to run toward her for the last year of her life instead of run away from her. It was not the easiest thing to do, but oh my God, I'm so glad because I would have missed out on so much if I hadn't done that. And I can't pretend to say that making that choice in front when faced with your trauma and your coping mechanisms you've come up to manage it, that it's the right move for everybody or that any time is the right time because I'm sure my brain created that light switch for a reason, right? To protect me when I wasn't safe, right?
It's
Um,
easier that way. When you don't have to feel, you don't have to face things, it's easier.
yeah,
You just exist.
yeah. And I think there are probably moments where I don't know, what do you think? I think that there are probably moments where all we can do is exist. And like we need it, just like the days where we need like comfort food or we can't go to work or we need a mental health day. Like there are moments where like maybe the pain is so deep and so difficult that you don't need it or that you don't or you can't deal with it. And that is a great tool. But the problem with that tool is once you pick it up, how do you put it down?
I always think if you keep pushing something off, one day you are just you're gonna lose it because there's something's gonna happen and all that stuff, all those feelings, all those thoughts that you pushed aside, they coming out whether you want them to or not. You
Yeah.
can't hide all that forever. You will get sick. You will literally get sick because your body doesn't know what to do with it.
Hmm. Like that idea that we're keeping almost keeping a secret from ourselves. We're trying to hide it. But at the same time, we're allowing a kind of cancer to fester inside of us without like, treatment. That's an
Oh,
interesting
for
thought.
sure.
Yeah. And there's the piece of it where it's like there's a downstream effect of that. And I think one of the kind of brightest revelations in this has been like being able to feel and have those emotions. I can tell you that the last 2 years of my life have been like being a toddler again, like crying at a dime it allows me to be more vulnerable again. It allows me to love people more deeply. So there are all those I think positive things about it, but when I look back in life during the period where I actually had tremendous success, I rebuilt my life after leaving the New York Times in a scandal. All these good things were going on, but even I had difficult time connecting with even my mom. I had difficult time connecting with the people who were closest to me. I had a 10-year relationship and with my current best friend because we there was no the most intimate version of relationship with me was still, even though I didn't realize it, 10 feet away. Because even though I didn't think of it that way, I truly operated in a world with plenty of optimism, but a firm belief that nothing was safe enough to be within this zone, if that makes sense. And I think there's the harmful part for me, right? That loss of opportunity for deep connection. But I also think there's a harmful part for other people because other people, like, they hear our words, right? And I don't throw I love you around, but whatever it is, I never have really been an I love you thrower. But what they hear socially, there's certain acceptable things that you say in any interconnection with other people, and they hear these words from me, but they don't have the same meaning for me. They don't have the same depth for me. So I'm these relationships would develop where I would have deep relationships for them with me, but it never had that same depth for me. And so in retrospect, not only do I owe like 10,000 people an apology, but I was fostering and nurturing a connection toward me that I didn't really have for them, and that inevitably led to hurt and disappointment because those words meant something to them that they never meant to me. And that's another revelation, like, my lack of tending my trauma with a healthy coping skill has had a great cost for other people.
I could totally see that because you weren't emotionally available for them. You had cut that off. And it seems like you probably weren't even there for yourself emotionally. You were just out to lunch. You had that
Mhm.
sign up and it never went down.
Well, gone fishing. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's yeah, and it ends up being a synergistic effect, but I think one of the you probably see this in people too, that we have social norms, and there's certain things we do, and there's certain things we say, you buy someone flowers, you give them a gift, you do X, Y, or Z, you ask them how their weekend was, right? Like, all these social niceties. And I'm sure, like, the weekend one is a great example because I think it's about 50-50 of us who, like, actually wanna know what your weekends and the other 50% of us are like, "Don't care." It's just totally being so nice.
Oh,
I
oh,
think
wait, no, you know what my favorite is? When someone goes, "Hey, how you doing?" But they keep
they
walking.
keep
So
walking.
you're
I mean, they're
do you
looking
walk?
I
How's your day?
I literally had that happen in the hallway today. What is what right just like, "How are you doing?" And she's through the doors before she's leaving to get a word out. But yeah, so those things are like harmless versions of them. But we have all sorts of similar social things that we do, I think, in close friendships that carry deep meaning. And here's what I felt. Here's what I felt I was it was a mimicry that I was modeling and singing the song of a human, and it would convince people that I was a human and that I was actually connected to them. But it was really just me replicating the social norms around me.
So
Does that make
inside,
sense?
were you like, "I am a robot."
Remember what it felt like. It's like the mhm, mhm. And actually, people would comment. They'd be like, "We're in the middle of a crisis. Why are you so calm?" I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "I am robot Jason." Wrapping problem in front of us. But yeah, I think it felt I think at times it felt like that, but I think at times it's very funny because I think at times it just felt, "Oh, that's what I'm supposed to say because that's what that person needs to hear to feel better, so I'm gonna say this right now." And it felt you know what it felt like? It felt like a math equation. Alright, person feels, 7, and we need to get them to 10, so we need 3, and if I put 1 plus 2 together, that equals 3, and if I give it to them, then they're a 10, and we're good.
And that's why I hate math.
Don't worry, I'm not even sure if any of that math added up.
Letters and numbers don't go together in either feelings.
Oh, that's so funny. It's so true. It's so true. I think if I had a message back to the people, I think certainly people there are a lot of people who feel like they've never gone through something traumatic, and I suspect there are some people on this planet. They're probably all 1 years old now. Birth is probably traumatic. But but I'm sure there are people somewhere out there who don't. But I think we should all search our soul for our suffering and spend some time thinking about how it affects our lives. And I just think I'm so lucky to have that therapist who got me focused on what was it subtracting from my own life and joy. Like this joy thing, as I began to unravel it, I realized I had concluded joy is just not work. And I will tell you, I've been a bumbling mess for the last 2 years, emotionally a bumbling mess. It's been so awesome. It has been so unbelievably awesome. And look, I felt an amount and a measure of love for other people and have been able to accept other people's love in a way that I'm just baffled. I would pay any price for this. Right. I was talking to somebody today, mm, helping out this friend of a friend who has cancer. And so I'm providing some financial support, doing some other things, some emotional support. And I was talking to another friend who's not a part of that circle about it today. And I was like, if I could go in and take her cancer away from her and take it myself and have it, I would. And my friend said, totally believe you, actually. I believe you would. And being able to feel that kind of love for people and being able to give that kind of love to people, I for me, the emotional safety of being able to flip that switch off is not worth the joy and sense of connection that comes from that. It's not worth I don't think I would have ever found peace in the grief of my mom's passing. I don't think I would have been able to look at it and even understand. I think I would have felt the grief, but I would have had no idea what it was. And because I've come to the conclusion that my grief has really just been love that has nowhere to go. And to me, I think being able to take that love, being able to take that legacy, the things that my mom did and grab her love and pass it along to other people, I don't think any of that would be happening if I hadn't opened myself up to them. So
You probably never would have spent that time with her,
yeah.
and it just would have been
Yep.
another day that something happened, but it's so powerful, and I'm so happy that you did choose to actually do the work, because if not, just think of how much more you could have missed out on.
Yeah. 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 And I see it like being sober. Like it is a daily struggle. Some days are easy, some days are hard, like any habit you're trying to break. But so far, and I can't say it, I'd be lying to you if I told you like the last year has not been filled with other elements of grief. But even in those moments where I felt deeply sad about things, there's also this sense of appreciation that I feel in those moments of sadness. Appreciation, just like anything you lose, right? You can lose your favorite toy and cry about your favorite toy, as you should, because it was your favorite toy. And you can also appreciate your time with it too. And I think if I didn't cry, because I could flip the switch and not cry, I'd also probably not appreciate in the same way. It would be like
The
taking
toy
art off my wall and losing some of the beauty.
it would mean it didn't mean anything to you. Well, clearly it did.
There it is. And I don't know, man, like, it's funny too because, and I think, some of it's gendered, some of it's not, but I think some of it's also race could play a role in it, but I think we're whatever it is, like, we're not we as humans are not wired to think of ourselves as victims of things, and I think very often that mentality leads to us to, become victims of ourselves and our self-delusion. And I think just being able to search your life and identify your suffering and seeing how it impacts you and how it impacts other people and seeing how you can find good out of it. It's just been a life lesson. If you go back to being sexually molested and then being able to help out my friends there and then going through this kind of trauma and in the last year being able to love people more deeply. None of that happens if I don't open myself up and if I'm not willing to be vulnerable. My podcast wouldn't exist. I don't think if I had made that decision. Or it would exist in some much more annoying form, I think.
I was thinking about that, not the annoying part, but would it exist?
Yeah,
You're trying to help people. Would you be wanting to help people?
possibly. I think I would have been wanting to help people, but it would have been like your Tesla wants to drive. It would be like a robot doing it. And I think that the big difference there is you're going back to that math, you're going through the mathematical formula of helping people, like the script, and you're not going through it becomes very objective and it eliminates the subjective things like the art of it, the vulnerability, the spiritual part of it, all these things that come to bear that logic cannot solve or figure out. But yeah, it would have been a boring podcast. It would have been like puzzle.
You would have been on there, Johnny number 5.
Yes. It would have been the opposite of your podcast for sure. Like, let's talk about our feels. And this is going to come back to your podcast. I think that's really been one of the blessings of this, but your listeners don't know. Like, I'm messaging you about guests. You're like, I've had her on twice. And then I'm like grabbing and going and listening to those episodes. I've gone through your backlog and in every episode learned something beautiful and relatable. Even when I'm like looking at the description of the episode and I'm like, well, that has nothing to do with me, but I may want to know something about that. Halfway through, I'm like, oh yeah, that that does.
Oh, but I love that so much.
Yeah. I think it's the power of like when you allow people to really tell their stories, things become relatable in ways that they wouldn't. And I think there are all sorts of social ills I think that could be addressed by if we just had the opportunity, which comes back to my podcast, I think, to be able to talk to people intimately and listen to them and hear them. I think we have a tendency to focus on that like narrow sliver of what's different about us. And people are way more alike than they are different. We have way more in common than we. And that, and going back to the episode with you, people who are perpetrators of things or who do bad acts, whether it's a mistake or not, we often look at them as so unbelievably different than us. But in reality, like the amount that's different than us is like this or nothing. And it gives us an opportunity to love them more deeply, to love ourselves more deeply, to be honest with ourselves about who we are. Right. And that one is a tough one. Because when you're watching that, I don't know, pick that murder trial and you're demonizing the accused or are you really looking at them realistically? If you can't see the parts of them that are like you, maybe you'll never commit a murder. Maybe this has nothing to do with murder, but that person loved their kid like you do. That person did X, Y, or Z like you do. And I think that there's something about accepting that allows us to connect. I hate to sound like a James Taylor song, but like I'm, I think there's just a real opportunity to shower people with love if we accept that we're more alike than we are different.
Absolutely. They're all people. And so many of the serial killers, obviously, you have a choice to make when you've been molested, neglected, abused. You have choices. You can live in that trauma for the rest of your life. You could fix yourself, or you could become a victor yourself and victimize people. Unfortunately, sometimes people don't know where that cross comes to.
Mm,
And so they keep pushing and pushing, and now you are way too far.
right.
But I don't think any of them really expect to go that far. It always starts
Yeah.
off with fantasy.
Yeah. And
Always.
I don't think Johnny is generally walking down the street thinking, as a 4-year-old, like when I'm an 18-year-old, I want to carjack someone and kill them. Or I don't think, to your point about like serial killers, and there may be exceptions, right? Because we don't know everyone's history. But even if you look at somebody like Ed Kemper or some of the most notorious serial killers, um, I don't, it didn't, it doesn't, it tends not to start out with wanting to do harm, but to your point, it starts out with wanting to fulfill a fantasy. The thing about a fantasy is the more quote unquote societally deviant your fantasy is, the more you have to hide it, the more, to your point from before, the more it builds up and it builds up and it twists and becomes bigger. And then all of a sudden, you have this giant ball of harm that is the only way that you can feel fulfilled.
Right.
And I think, by the way, that's relatable to everyone because if you walked into an AA meeting down the street, they would say you're only as sick as your secrets and you need to process this stuff. Like that part of it, like maybe not the serial killing part, but that part of what's going on internally, 100% relatable. If you're honest.
You're only as sick as your secrets. Oh, why do I love that so much?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it's fundamental, and those are also the secrets you hide from yourself. But I think it's fundamental in just taking it back to the alcoholic's idea is that obviously things are not going well when you're an alcoholic and you're drinking, but actually the real sign that things are going off the rails usually comes before you start drinking and you start keeping secrets and you start lying and they become poison. Because what does that poison of a secret become? It becomes shame. It drives really fast past guilt and straight into shame. And what does shame cause you want to do? Make poor decisions. Right? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It all builds on each other.
And it cuts you off from your support too. That's the other thing about secrets. Just like you were talking about serial killers or we're talking about alcoholics, having secrets cuts you off from the people that you that support. I have a client who's doing really well, this relatively young client. He's been doing exceptionally well. I've been working with him on and off for years. He's come back from college. First 3 months of beautiful stability. And he said to me today that he had, for the first time in 6 months, he had anxiety and an urge to have a drink, and he bought alcohol and he had a drink. But his mom and his brother are important parts of his sobriety. And I'm not going to tell him because I'm not going to tell my mom because she's having a procedure coming up and I don't want her to worry. And I genuinely believe that that's what his reason was. And I was like, okay, you keep that secret for 3 days. Let's see how that works. Like, you not only will you be carrying a secret that you think about every time that you talk to her, you'll be cutting off your support. And if you go and you tell her right now that it just happened yesterday, it's going to be a sign of improvement to her. I don't think it's going to cause her to worry. And I really do believe that like eliminating secrets does not mean sharing everything with everyone in the world about you, right? We all have different masks that are legit and perfectly fine. Always having someone that you can share the things that you're struggling with or that are ailing you or that you're wondering about or that scramble things in your brain. I think it's just an important part of always staying healthy.
Yeah. I mean, you're allowed to let your mind wander and to think about some weird shit. Just don't live there and don't act on it.
Yes, yes. And yeah. And I think to that point, like don't let it be a source of shame, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's no turning back once, then it's lie, lie.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, like I've spent a lifetime of watching people like because as a reporter, you're constantly paying attention to this. We all see it, but like building themselves up and then falling off a pedestal. There are a couple common things I see, like those challenges of shame and hiding things. And in that combination of like shame hitting pride and that unwillingness to admit that you need help and you need to be vulnerable. This is why probably I cry as many tears on my podcast as my guests do, because I'm trying to, in every one of those interactions, open my whole heart up uh, to what's in front of me, because I think I've realized over time that the pride's not going to get me anywhere. Like looking strong or looking tough or being, and the people who are attracted to that and who need that all the time are not going to be the people who are going to be able to love me in any deep, authentic way. So, anyway,
Yeah, they're not your people.
no, you are my people.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to have you back on some point soon. We're going to 2 times a week in November. So, look out.
Ooh, good for you.
Yeah, it's going to be crazy town. I think what really happened to me was like, I was like, look, I keep on coming up with all these ideas for guests. My listeners are now coming up with all these ideas for guests, and I want to talk to them all. And I want to talk to them all tomorrow. And I was like, well, my life is not long enough to get to all these guests. And then the solution was like simple. Wait, hold on. I can double up. It's gonna be exciting. It's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be fun. And hopefully we'll get a chance to have you back on sometime soon.
I would love that.
Cool.
I'll make sure I put a link to your podcast in the show notes so people can check out your podcast because it is very uplifting and amazing.
Thank you. Just like yours, my friend, just like yours.
Is there anything you wanted to leave the listeners with?
Love yourselves enough to take a risk.
That's right. That's right. And if you know anyone who could use this episode, please share it with them. We need to share the wealth of knowledge that we all put together in this world. Our experiences equal knowledge. And sometimes we can save people from such heartache in the future from helping them where they are now. So please, anyone listening, if you're like, oh my gosh, Timmy needs to hear this, send it to Timmy. Send it. All right. Thank you so much for being on, Jayson. I really enjoyed this.
You'll be good, my friend. I will see you soon, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure too.
Yeah, no joke. Let me hit in recording.